faces here. This is, I believe, the 20th Nessa Wolfson Coloquium, and I think that the Wolfson family, who are gathered here, and Dr. Pika and I are maybe the only ones who've been here at all 20, but I seem to remember everything around. But there are many that have been here many of you have been to a number, it's a goodly number. And I want to also especially welcome those who are here for the first time, and therefore joining this LLE and this TESOL ICC tradition that Nessa Wolfson was such a key person in getting started all those many years ago. Dr. Pika will be telling me more about that in just a minute in her remarks, but I just have two things to say before we begin. First, I do want to acknowledge and thank Elaine for the care and thought and l'amor that she puts into organizing and coordinating this for us. She makes sure that we are well and tastefully set up and well and tastefully fed so we can celebrate together. It means a lot. And I also just want to say one word about our speaker, Professor Larsen-Freeman. Thank you so much for being here. Dr. Butler is going to introduce her, but as I was telling her earlier, she has been a presence here in many, many ways, although she's never physically been here. One of the ways that she's been a presence that I remember is that in my very first years when I used to teach structured English, I met Diane Larsen-Freeman in her book, the grammar book that she wrote with Marianne Seltzer. And she told me that I was using the first edition, which was the white book. And really, I've been in awe of it ever since. And that was a magnificent book, and it's just one of your many, contributions to our field. So, thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to turn the word over to Dr. Pika to give you the context history and, well, in her inimitable style, she's going to introduce the event, and then Dr. Butler will introduce herself. And please do plan to stay for lunch afterwards. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Honored to be standing here. This is our 20th Wolfson Coloquium, which we celebrate as our porcelain anniversary of the Wolfson Coloquium. I didn't realize it was 20th anniversary was a porcelain time, but it did remind me of our whole event. This luminous and durable substance originated in the country of China, which is why we now refer to porcelain as China. But despite its local origination, China is now cherished worldwide. And we are grateful that our annual Wolfson Coloquium has been able to attract scholars and researchers from the world over for so many years. Nearly all of our speakers have been colleagues of Dr. Wolfson. Each has been a follower of her work. Every one of them has been a luminary in the field of educational linguistics, and Nessa Wolfson would have been quite pleased, a bit overwhelmed, and humbly grateful to know that our speakers would keep coming year after year to spend the day with us. Nessa Wolfson has remained one of the most important foundational scholars in our field. And she would be thrilled to know that Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman is our speaker today. Some of you who are with us for the first time might be wondering why we would come together year after year to this special event. You might be asking yourself, who is Dr. Wolfson? I'd like to share with you some of the highlights of her brilliant but also brief career. Dr. Wolfson originated the Educational Linguistics Department in 1976. She started out as an instructor, earned an assistant professor appointment, and worked her way up to become the first female full professor in the school and the first female division chair. Her appointment was timely. Educational linguistics and TESOL were emergent fields, and they had multiple facets: the professional, the scholarly, the political, all deeply rooted in research, and an update and a update on their theoretical views was badly needed. To lead such a challenge required vision, dedication, intellect, and enthusiasm. Dr. Wolfson had all of these virtues and then some. Her appointment was not only timely, it has proved to be timeless. The educational linguistics program has continued to expand in size and influence throughout our school and university, across the region, and indeed all over the world. Were it not for her untimely death, all too early in life from cancer, some 20 years ago at age 55, Dr. Wolfson would continue to build our academic program, monitoring faculty, mentor them, mentor her students, and carry out a rigorous research agenda. Gratefully, she left us a legacy of excellence and a spirit of energy that has remained with us as we have expanded our faculty student cohort and course offerings. I can assure you, as you begin your courses, Dr. Wolfson's name will appear as author of your course readings, as a citation and bibliographies at the end of the course readings, and as a reference in your library searches as well. Newer students in my classes, many of them who were young children when Dr. Wolfson was immersed in her research, bring up her work to explain data on non-native speakers' literacy patterns and discourse features. They often turn to her studies on the conversational historical present, the switch from past to present and present to past as a topic highlighter rather than tense marker. I have to remind them that it was Dr. Wolfson who made this fascinating discovery close to 40 years ago. Rather than think of this switch as a failure to maintain tense consistency, an error of interlanguage, or an indicator of some non-standard variety, Dr. Wolfson found that it was a marker of emphasis, and it connected discourse. It was a very effective feature. A gifted sociolinguist, Dr. Wolfson was fascinated with the rhythms and roles of everyday communication, and our friendships and families and our shop stores, work sites. She was always able to unravel the most seemingly disconnected messages and find the regularities within. And although she loved sociolinguistics, she respected all of the traditions and made sure that they were available and honored throughout our program. We always led the school in hosting visiting scholars, visiting professors, invited guests, and unexpected visitors. We welcomed people from all over the world, from all walks of life, and of course we still do. Just 2 weeks ago, I found a message in my school mailbox from a professor from Ibadan University in Nigeria, whom Dr. Wolfson had invited as a visiting scholar 35 years ago. I was away at the time, but would have been here. It would have been nice to catch up with him, to know that a dear colleague had taken time to review our friendship and collegiality. Aside from our world-renowned ethnography forum, convened by Nancy Hornberger each year, the Wolfson Coloquium is one of our longest public lecture events in the history of our school. The Nessa Wolfson Coloquium was our way of acknowledging and respecting Dr. Wolfson for sharing her legacy with all of you. There are many ways we could honor a gifted colleague, a dear friend who left us. We could put up a plaque, bring up a commemorative painting or a photo, issue a special volume of our own working papers. We decided to do things differently. Following Dr. Wolfson's way, we looked out for our students. At commencement each year, we bestow the Heinz Wolfson Award to a top graduating student. Right on our division floor, we maintain the Wolfson Reading Collection, which is a treasure trove of scholarly volumes for all of you, our students and colleagues, to enjoy. Many of these classic volumes were donated by Dr. Wolfson and our former Dean Del Hines, and others were donated by Nancy Hornberger more recently. And we hope that you will partake in all of these wonderful books. Foremost among these tributes is our Wolfson Day. Sorry, I'm trouble with my eyes. Our colloquium has been blessed with gifted speakers and loyal colleagues and friends. Our speaker today is Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman, professor at the University of Michigan. Dr. Larsen-Freeman was one of Dr. Wolfson's many colleagues, and she will be introduced by you in a while. I have heard Dr. Larsen-Freeman speak at many occasions, which isn't hard to do, because she is a very favorite conference speaker, from our head TESOLies to international TESOL. She just is so available and heartwarming to hear. And it gives me very special joy, as I have told her already, that she accepted our invitation to be here for one day today. Dr. Larsen-Freeman always has a new concept, a new way of looking at the field, a new study to introduce, a new book to introduce, as she draws from her enormous background in linguistics, language, and the arts to make connections with TESOL education and applied linguistics. She has a wonderful way of connecting with her audience, as you will soon find out. In the academic world, Dr. Larsen-Freeman, though much younger than I, is actually my grandmother. She was the mentor of my mentor, Michael Long, who is also younger than me. I remain ever grateful to her for that and for her. Our speaker series would not be possible without Harvey and Judy Wolfson and the Wolfson family. Mary, Mark, who is here with Dana, and Diane, whose son has come to us, his son Sam from Texas. Harvey and Judy Wolfson now live in Florida, but they join us every year. The Wolfsons make it possible for us to come together each year and invite a distinguished colleague, such as our speaker today. The Wolfson Coloquium is impossibly grateful to our division colleagues, especially Nancy Horberger and Penny Creedon, who have focused countless hours of long days of attention and care to coordinating our Wolfson Coloquium for so many years. And also to Suzanne O, who designs the invitations, and Lorraine Hightower, who makes sure that everybody gets one. And of course, our student coordinator, Elaine Aller. For the second straight year, Elaine has done a wonderful job of bringing everybody together with intellectual enrichment and a chance to get to know each other better. I would also like to thank our Dean and Porter for his support of this day. All of my colleagues who join year after year, like me, Dr. Hornberger, Vivian Gaston, and Susan Lytle, knew Dr. Wolfson and had the opportunity to work with her. I would also like to thank the editors of WEPL, who publish our colloquium speaker papers. WEPL was an established series by our students with the support of Dr. Wolfson when she was our division chair and their teacher and mentor, and she would have been very proud of the fact that WEPL is the longest-lived consecutive series of linguistics working papers in the world. Once we start something, we just can't stop. Keeping it going and improving it. What can I say? I'd also like to acknowledge our senior editors at WEPL, Nancy Barber and Kathy Howard. Third. All of you. I just cannot. I did this on double print. I should have done the same. Over the years, we've had many distinguished social linguists come to speak with us, beginning with Dr. Wilson's mentor, Del Himes. Del Himes, if you haven't heard, passed away earlier this year. We mourn his loss, and we also cherish his memory, as he really, really, truly left a distinctive mark on our school. A world-renowned linguist and anthropologist himself, he was a different kind of educational king. He made language and literacy a key cornerstone of our school, and that distinction has remained with us throughout the academic world. Very seldom do you find an education school with a department of language and literacy such as ours. We have also heard from brilliant scholars such as Joshua Fishman, Leslie Beebe, Andrew Cohen, Alid Olstein, Miriam Eisenstein, Timothy Epsworth, Carol Edelsky, and Keith Chick. Last year we heard from Elaine Jerome, who spoke the entire day with us. She started with a morning lecture and she ended with a workshop in the afternoon, and I'm sure she went home very, very tired because we kept her very busy with presidents. Several years ago we heard from Rebecca Freeman, who is now a prize-winning author and an adjunct professor at GSE, and she was our Wolfson Colloquium coordinator for many years as well. In the year of our 25th silver anniversary of our program, we heard from one of Dr. Wolfson's first students and our first educational linguistics doctoral graduate, Anna Celia, whose work I know that many of you love and use in your own research and scholarship. 2 years ago, we celebrated the 30th year of the Educational Linguistics Program, our Pearl anniversary. We were honored by Bernard Spolsky, who along with Del Hines, introduced the term and the content of educational linguistics to the field of educational linguistics. They established the country's first 2 university programs, and of course, left it all to Dr. Wolfson to figure out how to implement it, which indeed she did. Luckily, days after she had just finished her doctorate and filed her dissertation, she was asked to conceptualize the educational linguistics and TESOL program and get them underway right away by September. A few years later, she also conceptualized the intercultural communication program, and that got well underway quickly as well. The foundation that Dr. Wolfson established is reflected in the growth of the educational linguistics program over the years and the shining success it has remained to date. We are 35 years old as a program, older than many of you. Several of our graduates have graced our Coloquium as well. Christine Millmeyer, Jessica Williams, Catherine Dowdy, and Valerie Carr, who have been active and vital contributors to our field. We invite our graduates not because they are graduates, but because they are one of the leading scholars and researchers in the field. Christine Millmeyer, as some of you know, was director of Penn's English language programs, but she went on to become the dean of Penn School of General Studies and an adjunct professor here at Penn, and now is dean of the College of General Studies at Columbia University. Kathy Dowdy and Jessica Williams have published the universally applauded research book Focus on Form, which remained and has actually increased in popular demand since its publication over a decade ago, much like the grammar book of Dr. Larsen-Freeman. They are professors at the universities of Maryland and Illinois. Valerie Carr is a professor at David Yellin University in Jerusalem, and she was president of TESOL as well. Nancy Kornberger has also been a Coloquium speaker, as well as dean of GSE, which some of you students might not know. Fortunately, she returned to us as professor and director of the Educational Linguistics Program. Before we move on to our speaker, I would like to share with you a few more reflections on Dr. Wolfson's contributions to our field. Many researchers live in a world of theory and ideals, often immersed in an academic culture that ignores the everyday lives of people. Dr. Wolfson listened to people. To know Dr. Wolfson was to be accustomed to having your conversation or comment transcribed for scientific posterity. She had a careful ear for the language of everyday life. Before the surveillance laws even took effect, she left her tape recorder in front of everybody. She didn't have to hide it. She had the dynamism to attract informants who would just talk for hours and hours and hours, and they would just simply forget that the tape recorder was there. She collected dozens of tapes, all inventoried in shoeboxes, and used extensively in her work. We did not have laptops or storage systems or keychains or any of that at the time. She wrote about things that affect our everyday lives, the way we talk about ourselves and others, the way we tell stories, how we give compliments, accept them with grace, extend invitations that don't get followed up, make promises we can't keep, and offer excuses and apologies in times of stress. She spoke out and she spoke often, and we listened and learned. She encouraged students and faculty like myself to do likewise. She demonstrated some of the hallmark traits of leadership. She took care of those who were just starting out. When you worked with Dr. Wolfson, she made you look good. A student of society and culture, an expert on language and gender, a former ESL teacher before she became a professor, she lived in many worlds, and she knew how to inspire others with a personal comment or a moment of her time. Together with colleagues in the US, Israel, Asia, and Europe, she established an international cohort of linguists who compared everyday language use in their countries, such as France, Denmark, Germany, and Japan, but those of our own. She was also one of the earliest scholars in the field of linguistics to become actively interested in the role of sociolinguistics in the language curriculum, in the training of teachers, and in the understanding of second language acquisition. She established the TESOL and Sociolinguistics Coloquium at the annual TESOL convention, which attracted several hours of papers and a wide-ranging audience every year. She was a leading figure in the larger matters of language policy, especially in Asia and Africa, among people who often didn't have a say in these matters. She called this the language of equality, and it led to an edited collection of papers, as well as a course that we now call Sociology of Language, and another on language and power. Her research extended beyond the classroom lecture platform. She was a strong advocate and defender of bilingual and immersion education, but was willing to point out how poorly resourced academically and managerially these were, and advocated to make them quality level education. In only a few decades as a scholar, professor, and researcher, she helped to move the study of linguistics and the role of sociolinguistics into the forefront of language education. This is something that we take for granted today, though it was an enormous challenge when she first started out. Needless to say, Dr. Wolfson showed a remarkable ability to confront the challenge that her illness created. She never let her cancer get in the way of her work. When her doctors ordered her to go to the hospital for a lung tap or some crazy x-ray, she would run over to the Penn's emergency room, get what had to be done, and come right back and continue on the job. Even in the final week of her life, she came to GSE to participate in a doctoral proposal hearing. That student, Anna Assis Peterson, went on to get her PhD, become a tenured professor with published research papers, and she's now still mentoring new scholars into the field. I don't know how difficult it was a decision to keep going. I do know that Dr. Wolfson loved what she did, and she did it well. She accomplished a great deal for our program, school, and field. If she were with us here in person instead of in spirit, she would be urging us to continue to go on as she did herself. And as we have done here at our program as well. Thousands of students and scholars, friends and colleagues, may yet to benefit from her work. But I and the hundreds of others who knew Dr. Wolfson, even a little bit, are grateful to have known her as a colleague, friend, author, and leader. With her death, the GSA community lost a beloved teacher and an eminent scholar. Her life well lived, her family deeply loved, her students carefully mentored, our field enriched. She left us with an example of courage and optimism, and an abiding enthusiasm for her students and colleagues that I believe is still felt among us as we gather today. I thank you all very sincerely for coming out, as Nessa Wolfson would have done as well. It's wonderful that we can all be together as we cherish our past, enjoy discussion gathering, and look forward to our future with all of you. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Diane Larsen-Freeman. Diane is a professor of linguistics and also professor of education at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. As we all know very well, Diane is one of the most distinguished and most influential scholars in our field. I just want to put some personal note as well about the grammar book. Nessa just mentioned, because that was the book that I first encountered studying English and preparing for entrance exams to get into college, I found the book, the grammar book. The grammar book has been a bestseller and it has been translated into many languages. And I was in Tokyo, And I found the book absolutely fascinating. And since then, the grammar book has been my Bible, and still is. Those who are taking my educational linguistics, you're going to read her work in the class. So it's going to be very exciting. Now, Diane has been so influential in our field. She has a wide range of interests in linguistics, applied linguistics, of course, psychology, cognitive science, and many other fields as well. And she also has published numerous articles, book chapters, and books, and has won so many awards. One of the most exciting aspects in her work, in my view, is that her work is always very revolutionary. Her work always challenges us, challenges our way of looking at the world, which we might take for granted. Her work always gives us a new insight, new way of looking at the world. She is truly interdisciplinary. Most recently, or I would say the last 1 decade or so, she has been incorporating different theories which originated in other fields, and including complexity theories and dynamic theory, and I believe that she's going to talk about in detail today. And they are revolutionary, changing our way of conceptualizing language acquisition, how language works, language evolution, and so forth. So we are very, very, very excited to have her today. I'm for sure she's going to open up a door for us to a new world, and we can't wait to see what's out there. So her title today goes, I guess, Language and Language Development as Complex Dynamic System. Again, let's welcome Dr. Larsen-Freeman.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's very kind. Wow. I think I'll stop right there. Thank you for that warm welcome. Thank you to Dr. Nancy Hornberger for extending the original invitation to come be part of the Nessa Colloquium today, Nessa Wolfson Colloquium today. Thank you to Elaine Allard for making the arrangements, to Lorraine Hightower for supporting Elaine, Lorraine for supporting Elaine, for Ji-Yun Lee's escorting me this morning, for Dr. Terry Pika reminding me and acknowledging that she's my grand mentee, and Dr. Yuko Butler for a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. It amuses me a little bit that people remember me first from the grammar book and then really want to meet me after that's how they first encountered me. I would think that would be very off-putting. But you see, I do smile and I am vital, and so maybe I can do something to, how shall I say, to overcome the reputation of being one of the grammar book authors. Of course, I also want to thank the Wolfson family for their continuing sponsorship of the Colloquium, and personally for an opportunity for me to reminisce about Nessa, because I did know her, and not only reminisce, but as I was saying earlier, to learn some things that I didn't know. And that's a wonderful opportunity as well. I've never shared this before. It's a very personal thing, but I want you to know that I'm a survivor, and I'm one of the lucky ones. But you know, I've never said that publicly in a professional way, but I connect with Nessa for the travails that she had as well. Fortunately, as I said, I'm one of the lucky ones. So thank you. So, now how do I follow that? I follow that by getting on with it, Diane, and I quit all of this. I am going to talk, as Yuko Butler said this, I am a professor of education and a professor of linguistics. So we haven't gotten quite as gifted as you and quite as how shall I say, as seeing the connection. But I just taught yesterday before I left for the airport a course entitled Educational Linguistics. And I created the course and titled it, and partly inspired by your program here. Whipple, I didn't know that's how you said it, Dr. Pico, but now I shall use that. On the occasion of the 25th anniversary, Dr. Hornberger wrote, anthropological linguist Del Hymes agreed to become Dean of the Graduate School of Education because he believed profoundly in the need for change in language, in the way we understand language and what we do with language in schools. It's not too surprising then that one of the first things he did was to inaugurate educational linguistics with the appointment of Wolfson. I am going to speak today about a different way of looking at language, at least it's novel to me, and I'm going to invite you to consider that along with me, as well as some of the implications for that view. Sadly, we lost Del Hymes less than a year ago, as Dr. Pico reminded us, and it is the 20th anniversary of our loss of Nessa Wolfson. I knew Nessa as a sociolinguist. Who could forget her theory of the bulge? Although I must say I never did, given my girth, I never really liked talking much about the theory of the bulge, but as I inhale, get rid of the bulge. It's a fascinating idea, and if you don't know about the theory of the bulge, you really need to find out. As a TESOL loyalist, yes, we all have one, TESOL loyalist, organizing that colloquium, again, that Dr. Pico told us about, along with Elliot Judd, whom sadly we've also lost recently, Leslie Beebe, Miriam Eisenstein, Elise Liedelstein, and others. For her work on English grammar, which we did cite in the grammar book, her work particularly on the conversational historical present, for her research on speech acts, language inequality with Joan Manis and how power is reflected in language. I knew Nessa that way. What I didn't know, let me just say this. I love this. Linguistic inequality, like other forms of social inequality, is a problem of major dimensions in the modern world. Indeed, linguistic inequality may be particularly pernicious. One's native language is so much a part of one's identity that to denigrate it is to effectively deny one's human ability to communicate. I love that. That's a wonderful quote from the book by Wolfson and Manis. What I was going to say is I didn't know, this is some of the things I learned, that Nessa not only founded educational linguistics, but the TESOL and then the intercultural communication programs. And I didn't know, and I got this from the article, the memorial article by Christine Billmeyer, Sherry Michaud, and Teresa Pica, that she was about to embark on an ethnographic study working with language minority children and hoping to make a difference in and touching the lives of disadvantaged children. What a wonderful note about her and about her work and about her continuing influence. And I learned that in thinking about my remarks today. Okay, so I'm going to introduce, I really can't do this. I'm going to need, Zach, can you help me with this? I'm going to need to be able to see the computer, because otherwise I'm looking over my shoulder the whole time. Is it possible to move it up further? I'm sorry. I'm looking over here and I can't, maybe if I stand here, how's that? Yeah. Okay, never mind, Zach, I'll do this. I think I'll do this. Okay, so I'm going to introduce, as you heard, I'm going to introduce complex dynamic systems in which complexity is emergent, and I'll say something about that if that's not familiar. I'm going to suggest that language is a complex emergent system, one in which language grows and organizes itself from the bottom up in a kind of organic way, a bottom-up process, as well as other complex dynamic systems. And we can describe what results with rules, and that we do, but the systems themselves are not the product of rules. I'm going to suggest that complex dynamic systems represent a new transdisciplinary theme, and I use that term because it has widespread influence among many different fields in the physical and social sciences and the humanities, so it's transdisciplinary in that sense. But also it offers a theme in a different way, and I'll tell you what that is in a moment, that I think affords us a new theoretical perspective within our own field of language, L2 development, and educational linguistics. I'm going to suggest that the new theme that is contributed by complexity theory, also known as dynamic systems theory, is very much in keeping with the zeitgeist today, and I'll explain why I think that's true. I'm always interested in how new theories come about. What is it that's in the culture that gives rise to these ideas, and I want to try and connect it for you in a greater context. And then I'm going to offer a little more detail about the theory or theories, and I'll conclude, because I know some of you are interested in language teaching, and Nessa Wolfson was a teacher. I'm going to conclude with some very few remarks about teaching. I think all of that will take me about an hour, and then I hope I have some time. I will have some time. I'll make sure I have some time to interact with you following that. Okay, Hornberger and Holt, Francis Holt, also a graduate of the program, have written about Halliday, Michael Halliday, the linguist, call for a new transdisciplinary theme in applied linguistics, one that would supersede the disciplines from which applied linguists customarily draw, creating new forms of activity which are thematic rather than disciplinary in their orientation. So notice, a theme, the transdisciplinary is because it applies to more than one discipline, but it's transdisciplinary in the other sense that it has not been born within a discipline. It's an idea that, a new kind of creative idea that transcends all particular disciplines. And I think it won't be so surprising to see why this is important at this time, because if you stop and think about it, we've gotten a lot from our disciplinary knowledge, but we are increasingly hyphenating the disciplines, aren't we? We're talking about psychobiology, right? Or neuroeconomy, I heard the other day. We're trying to find a way to transcend the narrow disciplinary focuses, because or foci, we realize that the world is complex, and that pursuing in depth one field, of course, is very gratifying, and we've learned a great deal. But some of the world's problems are complex, and they're not to be solved or addressed by just going deeply. We have to go widely as well, and I think this theory allows us to do that. So we've had, though, transdisciplinary themes in the past. Evolution was one of them, and in science, when evolution was introduced, it was used widely in many different disciplines to, as I say, or as Halliday said, actually, to talk about the arrow of time, how things evolved and changed over time. That was a theme. Evolution was a theme. However, in the human sciences, Halliday says, we weren't ready for evolution at that point, not in the humanities and human sciences. Of course, we could talk about the evolution in biology, but not in the humans, because we didn't even have a sense of the system of our various endeavors, our various interests. And we needed a model of how there's an organization to, for example, in our case, language, and that system persists. And so in the human sciences, we eschewed really evolution. Instead, we opted for structuralism, trying to figure out how the system works, how it's organized, what the parts are, and how they fit together in a systematic way. And of course, we owe this man, he wasn't from Penn, right? I mean, everybody else I'm talking about is from Penn, but no, he was a Swiss linguist. And I put his picture up there, but I'm not going to read all these words at you. I've tried to highlight the important things, because I don't want to read at you anyway. But basically, Fernand de Saussure was interested in making linguistics a science. And he recognized that language is dynamic, but in the interest of making linguistics a science, he removed temporality. He atemporalized or detemporalized language, right? We'll look at it at one point in time. Of course, he knew about diachronic linguistics, but he chose to look at language at one point in time in order to understand its structure. Stop it, freeze frame it for a little bit. And he also removed speech as an object of investigation and said we should look for the underlying the social impersonal phenomena of language as a system of signs. And again, he was a brilliant linguist. We have Cicero a lot. But he made these decisions because he wanted to promote linguistics as a science. And he saw these steps, these moves to do that. And then somebody who does have a connection with Pennsylvania, that's what I meant. I started thinking about this. I thought, well, gee, I guess I've never been here before, but I feel as I have. Because then this man, who's also brilliant and also made a tremendous contribution to the field, followed suit in a structural way by saying what we're going to look at is competence, the idealized native language speaker's knowledge. We want to explain the internal mental system, the grammar that's decontextualized. And we want to, in particular, focus on the morphosyntactic subsystem, and therefore we'll segregate that from the rest of the language, treat language modularly. So we'll take morphosyntax away from the other subsystems, and we'll look at that, we'll elevate that. Again, the decisions, of course, Chomsky is very aware of many, many e-language features, but he chose to do this in order to promote the science of language as he saw it. Well, where does that leave educational linguists, though? I think we've inherited, we've gotten a legacy from structuralism, and some of this may resonate with you, that we have, many of us, not all of you, not sociolinguists maybe, but theoretical linguists have often viewed language atomistically, that is, having parts, and that learning it is aggregating those parts. Furthermore, we speak of language as if it is something one has, kind of a commodity, and I offer as evidence for that claim teachers and researchers, I'm sure I've done this myself, will say, well, I think that learner or my students now, they have the present tense. Have you ever heard that? They have it, suggesting a kind of ingesting of language and a kind of, how shall I say, kind of a closed system. That is, it's been brought in, internalized, and commodified language, commodified. Now, again, I have a lot of interest, it's true, and I never want to say that my latest thinking has put to rest or to shame any of the previous thinking. I think the structuralists made a lot of contribution. Certainly our knowledge of the sound system, for example, the phonemic inventory is a gift from that way of looking. But there's always a but, isn't there? Because when you choose to look at something in some way, then you ignore some of its other qualities, some of its other features. And I think there's been a cost to this because we have atemporalized, idealized, decontextualized, and segregated language, we who take a structural perspective. It's common enough in science, that's what scientists do, right? They do their work in a lab in a decontextualized way. But the sum total of all of those is that we're left with a compromised view of language to apply to our more applied purposes, our more applied enterprises. And here are some assumptions that I think follow from the structuralist legacy. And some of these you may object to, you may think are not fair, but I think these are assumptions that we have been operating under for some time, implicitly, maybe tacitly, but they're there. That there are fixed, homogeneous or homogeneous native and target languages. So we talk about English and we talk about Chinese as if they are things, entities, that they are rule governed, and that those rules are sentence level primarily. That second language acquisition is traversing that interlanguage continuum from a more or less homogeneous native language to a more or less homogeneous target language, and then we have it. That there are discrete stages through which learners traverse that interlanguage continuum along the way. That progress can be best determined in the dimension of one system, morphosyntax. That seems to be the one that we've followed the structuralist on. And again, not everybody has done this. I'm just talking about some of the fundamental, I think, assumptions that we have. That language development is purely a cognitive process. That's part of the internal mental grammar. that learners move through the process in a fairly consistent manner, and that it's possible to adopt a two-phase research agenda. I mean, I'll never forget Evelyn Hatch many years ago, who was I consider one of the founders of second language acquisition, said, you know, we need a two-phase research agenda. We need to first understand what the process of language acquisition is, language development is. And then we need to figure out why there's differential success among people, among learners, in terms of how far they succeed in that process, because we know second language acquisition, second language learners are not equally successful, right? So we want to do this. First, we'll understand the process, and again, you understand why you would do this. It's very complex. Understand the process. When we get the process figured out, then we'll try to figure out the learners and how far they get along in that process. But I think there are a number, and again, many people in this room share this, a number of problems and assumptions that these assumptions are problematic. And I think there's counter-evidence to many of them, and growing counter-evidence, because we have all of these more recent kind of linguistics that I think challenge the hegemony of the structural approach and treat language much more as an e-language, a language, external language, rather than internal mental grammar, contextualized language as actualized in a social process. And again, Nessa Wolfson was way ahead of the game in thinking of language this way, but not everyone in the field joined in. I'm going to claim then it's time to think about language in a different way, and again, I want to say that thinking of language as a static system of fixed rules has given us descriptive adequacy, but we have no vocabulary to talk about language as a dynamic system, which surely it is. It changes all the time. And the dynamism of language is what I want to share with you today and explain why I think it's important. And I'll do that first by explaining or offering some thoughts regarding the zeitgeist. Why is it coming up at this time? Well, the zeitgeist of the 1990s and the 2000s anyway have been decades of tremendous change. I don't have to tell you all that. Technology has sped up global communications. National economies have become interdependent. People began leading transnational lives. We had a lot of fluidity among populations of the world, less and less of a national identity perhaps, and more of a transnational identity, such that transnational flows of language and people make us now not able to assume that language learners to be native speakers of a single language, national language, learning and interacting with native speakers of another single national language, and moving inexorably in a line from the L1 to L2. Multilingualism is increasingly the norm. Now, I'm almost embarrassed to say that because it has been true long before my awareness of it. I was just in Austria last year. I had a Fulbright there, and multilingualism is just the norm, right? You don't even think about it. Whereas in this monolingual culture, we have to stop and remind ourselves that we're different from the rest of the world. But as soon as you enter or consider multilingualism, you realize that you can't think of language as this lockstep piece, because multilingualism is this system of languages and this tremendous interplay of languages that are operating all the time. It's not like languages are compartmentalized, right? So we need a different metaphor. We need a different way of looking at language if we want to understand and consider the multilingualism of people as opposed to the monolingualism becoming perhaps bilingualism, but maybe not. The 1990s and 2000s have also witnessed a concern with the organic. Remember I said this is an organic theory. It thinks language grows. Look at the metaphors I'm using. Well, I've been told that the 21st century is a century of biology, where the 20th century was a century of physics. If you just stop to think about it, what do we have? We had the genome, We have stem cell research, maybe. We have cloning, right? We have genetically altered foods, for better or for worse. You may not agree with all of these moves, but science of the 21st century seems to be a science of biology. That's what the scientists say. Recognizing our interdependence. I just gave you with my nonverbals, I said if we have this multilingualism and the interplay of languages, right? Well, if you see that way, then I think a related theme in the zeitgeist is this notion of the interdependence of us and the urgency of our working independently in order to address these major issues of our times, climate change, environmental concerns. Brain research showing us that the brain is not fixed, that we don't just learn and stop there. There's a great plasticity to the brain, constantly developing and changing throughout our lives, not just in our youth. Computational power, and in our field, giving us access to large corpora where we start to see the patterns of language, that a lot of them are not rule-governed, but conventionalized patterns, very variable, with certain ones dominant. And then I'm going to claim this last one, the genesis as being influential, the genesis of a theory that emanates from the physical sciences, chaos or complexity theory, dynamic systems theory, as I said, been called by scientists the new science. If you don't believe me, I brought along somebody who's going to give me some credibility on that. Stephen Hawking said a few years ago, I think the next century, meaning the one we're in now, will be the century of complexity. So you don't have to believe me, take his word for it, and we're in the same thing. You might want to say, well, Diane, why did you choose a theory from the physical sciences to try and help us understand language better? Why did you go there? Well, it wasn't a deliberate decision, quite honestly. I've always been interested in science, but that wasn't what, I didn't get driven to the scientific literature thinking I wanted a new theory of language. But as I started reading about complexity theory, it just made so much sense to me that it would be a good model, an interesting way of thinking about language. Because complex dynamic systems are dynamic. They're complex, and I'll tell you the way that that word is used. It doesn't mean complicated. They're nonlinear. They change suddenly or gradually, and then suddenly. There's not equal contributions. Well, do you know anything that's more dynamic, complex, and nonlinear than language? And so as I was reading about this, the bells started ringing in my mind, and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. This is not how I was trained to think about language. And with that interest, and I started reading a lot, I now feel like this is a good way, a useful way, a beginning way, an inchoate way, but a new way of thinking about language that I found very exciting. And with a new vision, a new way of thinking, and Yuko Butler claims it's revolutionary. I don't know, maybe it is. But with a new way of thinking, you have the gift of new questions to ask that have just entertained me for hours on end. And I still have many more to try and figure out the answers to. So I'm going to give you just 3 slides on the basic principles of complexity theory, dynamic systems theory. If you're not familiar with the theory, they're probably not going to be adequate, but I'll try to give you a sense of it. And then I'm going to go on and show you how it's applied, as I think, to language and language development, which will be a little closer to home and maybe easier to comprehend if this is all new to you. However, you could help me with that quest if you, as I go through these principles, if you think to yourself, language. This could be true of language. By the way, remember this is I'm arguing this is transdisciplinary. And so if you don't want to talk about language as according to these 12 that I'm going to discuss in a moment, you could think about an educational system because it applies to people, not only things, right? Or I don't want to call language a thing anymore. It applies to people as well as inert or inactive systems. So complex systems are open and dynamic. Remember I said before, we've operated under the idea that we'd somehow transmit language or engage students with it. It's not always transmission, but they would have it. So they would have it suggests a kind of well-defined box that has borders, right? But complex systems have no borders. They're open. They're open to infusions of energy from outside. They're dynamic. They're always changing. Always changing. I don't mean that they go a little way and then they stop for a while to rest and then they start again. They're always changing. I think that's true of language too, and I'm going to argue that in a moment. They operate under conditions that are not in equilibrium. Why? Because if you have equilibrium, you have stasis. You have things balancing out, and you have this kind of stasis. But they're not in equilibrium. There's always change possible. Do you know why it takes a long time for a child to learn how to stand erect or walk even? Do you have any idea? I mean, one of the reasons is that we're not in equilibrium. You realize we are affected by the laws of gravity. So being as big as I am, as we all are really, I mean, you're not as big as me, but we're big relative to our little feet that keep us in contact with that earth, that we're constantly going like this. We're not aware of it anymore. We think we're standing like this, but actually we're making these micro movements to keep us balanced. Otherwise, we'd topple with the force of gravity. So it's not equilibrium in the sense of stasis, right? It's this sort of like this, even standing. And that's true of many, many other things, of course. Complex systems are systems because they are comprised of many elements or agents which interact. Now, this is where the complexity comes in. It doesn't mean just complicated. It means that the different parts of the system, the different people in an educational system, the different subsystems of language interact. I'm doing this because that, I think, is the best way to do it. And out of that interaction, well, I'll say something more in a moment. Notice elements or agents, so you can think of language elements or you can think of agents as people. Change is central. The systems adapt both through the interaction with the environment and through internal reorganization, or what's called self-organization. The interactions result in a self-organized way, bottom-up system. The strength of the interactions changes over time. There are multiple routes possible. The complexity of complex systems is emergent. It's not built into any one element or agent, but rather arises from their interaction. And this is the way it's complex. No single element, no single agent, no single anything has the complexity of complex systems built in. But through the interaction, complexity arises. And the example that often is given is that of a bird flock. So you have individual birds, right? And then, have you ever wondered, how is it possible that they take off as one? Have you ever wondered that? Or they fly through the air as one, and they land again as one, perhaps separating for electrical wire along the way, and they land. That complexity is said to be emergent, right? It's not built in any one bird. It's through their interaction that this kind of superorganism is created. Do you follow that? That's the idea of complexity. It's complex at another level than the individual components. You don't see it in the individual components, you see it in their interaction. And Dr. Hornberg commented on a slide that I have, or if I have time, I'll show you, this interacting flock of birds. It's fascinating. Did you ever wonder, by the way, why they don't bump into each other? Did that ever occur to you? Well, when you see this thing at the end, I think you'll wonder even more how that's possible. How is this superorganism possible that they coordinate this? The systems are open. What arises may be in nonlinear relation to its cause. That's what I said earlier. In other words, an unexpected occurrence can happen at any time. The structure of a complex system is maintained even though its components may change. You can think of that easily with language, right? So French is, even though French is what? Changing all the time. But it still maintains an identity as French. The environment in which they operate is part of a complex system. Often what we do is take the system out and examine it separately. But you can't do that in complexity theory because it's connected to the environment. You've got to pay attention to that. Displays behavior over a range of time scales and at different levels of complexity. The different levels are nested. So if you were interested in studying a school system, you would have to look at the community in which the school was living. But also you would look at the school, its administration, the teachers, the policies, the classrooms, the students, the teachers, the minds. I mean, you could go to all these different levels in order to understand complex systems. Sometimes they become chaotic and varied. And this is an important point, and the last one. Complex systems iterate. They revisit the same territory again and again, which means that the present state of development is critically dependent on what precedes it. Now, if you got even a little bit from those, you're doing well if this is new to you, because they're sort of different ideas. Perhaps now as I move to language and language development, some of these ideas will become clearer. I hope so. Ask me later if they're not. So I see this then, I'm saying CT, complexity theory, DST, dynamic systems theory, as contributing to a new post-structural theme. Cuts across many areas. In applied linguistics, it transforms our objects of concern into processes and puts change in dynamic systems at the forefront of our investigation. And again, Saussure knew language was dynamic, but chose to sacrifice that in instance of making science, making linguistics a science. But maybe we don't have to sacrifice dynamism and still maintain a science, a way of looking at it that's scientific. So there are three ways that language is dynamic. You might think, boy, that's banal. Everybody knows language is dynamic. Well, it is. As I'm speaking, you're listening, time is passing, probably too quickly for me. And that's dynamic, right? Real time passing. Everybody knows that language changes over time, that the language of English of today isn't the English of Shakespeare. Everybody knows that. Language forms are continually being transformed by use. Joan Bybee said that in her 2006 presidential address to the Linguistic Society of America. So she talks about grammaticization, a process whereby new forms are created through use over time. The example being be going to as a marker first of intention and later became the future, the be going to future in we are going to have lunch after I finish. Notice that the be going to, I am going to leave now, is isomorphic. It's the same form as the present progressive or present continuous in English. So I can say I'm going to leave now, I'm going to the park now. The am going to is common to both, but only one of them has become a new construction, has fused to I'm gonna. So I can say, I'm gonna leave now. Oh no, I'm not gonna say that. I'm gonna speak now. But I can't say, I'm in the park now, can I? Notice it's the same form, but the first one, the future, the be going to future, has fused because of time and use and frequency of use. It's become a reduced form. If you don't recognize I'm gonna, you're gonna recognize gonna, right? Going to, which is what happens. And you wouldn't say, I'm gonna the park now, right? But you could say, I'm gonna leave now. There's a third kind of dynamism, though, and I think we often ignore it at our peril. It's the nexus, I call it organic dynamism. It's a nexus of real time and overtime. Because, of course, how does language change? How does be going to become the future and the fused form, I am going to? Except that it's in those moment-by-moment uses that over time accumulate and change the system. So it connects the two. And I came to this when I was reading James Blake's book, Chaos, the Making of a New Science. He said, the act of playing the game has a way of changing the rules. He wasn't talking about linguistic rules. This book had nothing to do with language. But I went, wow, because I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't thought about organic dynamism. I knew language changed over time. I knew language is dynamic in real time, but I hadn't put the two together in the way that that quote did for me. I like it a lot. Because you see, it's not just playing the game that has a way of changing the rules. It changes over time. It's how language is developed. It's how language is learned. It's how language evolves. It's how language can be taught. And so what I think it does, that idea, avoids the decontextualizing, the idealizing, the segregating and atemporalizing of language, sees language as a dynamic set of patterns emerging from use. Complexity arises from the self-organization and the interactions of many components. It helps us to understand that the language system is always in flux and that there's a massive variation in all features at all times. By the way, Kretschmer's book just came out last year, and he calls it the linguistics of speech. He said we need to have a linguistics that overlooks that other system that Saussure told us not to pay attention to. Language development. Jeff Ellman, famous cognitive psychologist, University of San Diego, he says, language development, well, it's about time. And he says this, and of course, deliberately playing on the words. But what he's saying is, we don't pay that much attention to time in language development. Instead, we look at development as a succession of snapshots. And we don't really appreciate the dynamism. So it becomes frozen and fixed, stage-like, if you will. And it biases our theoretical perspective. So he's saying, even in development, which you'd think would be a natural for dynamism, that's not always the case. It's not always what's brought to bear. So inspired by this, I said in 1997 we need to look at language, a second language acquisition in a different way. Nick Ellis and I said, yes, language is a complex adaptive system, and there's a special issue of language learning that came out last year that is devoted to that. And now we're talking about emergentism, which is related as well, that languages emerge in use, through use. Rejecting the idea of the need to posit an innate language acquisition development, a language acquisition device. Emergentists argue that humans are well suited to perceive and to assimilate the patterns in the language spoken to them. So the input is not as impoverished as Chomsky maintained. We have looked at, a number of people now are talking this way, showing that children learning their native language and adult learners learning the target language can bootstrap their learning by attending to the frequently occurring form, meaning, use constructions. I like this term. It comes from Thalen and Smith, and Thalen and Bates use it too. Constructions are softly assembled. Notice they're not hardwired. A construction is a form, meaning, use composite. And they're softly assembled. So in the moment when I'm engaged in a task or in a conversation or processing language on the radio, these things are assembled for that occasion. And I'll show you an example of what I mean by a construction in a moment. They're not hardwired, they're not rule governed. I cobble together what I can of the language I know to speak and use these, but they're ephemeral, these patterns, these constructions. They're created and dissolved as tasks and environments change. So here's an example. It's called the cause-motion construction. This comes from Goldberg's work, Adele Goldberg. I hope you appreciate the contextualized example. Roy Halladay of the Philadelphia Phillies. They were playing last night. My plane went right by the stadium. It was all lit up. Roy Halladay threw the ball down the middle of the plate. He is a pitcher of the Philadelphia Phillies, isn't he? Yes, okay. And I had to do this because I love his name. Chase Utley hit the ball over the fence, right? So this is the cause-motion construction. X causes Y to move Z. And that pattern is characteristic of both those sentences. Now, the question is then, here's the construction. We understand the caused motion notion of it, but language is not a closed system. It's an open system. We want to go beyond. So Adele Goldberg's idea is that there's kind of an inheritance. I don't necessarily like that idea, but the idea is that we can abstract from these instances, or not, I don't like the abstraction part. We can analogize, is what I would say, from these instances and make new meaning. So for example, Sally sneezed the napkin across the table. That might be a disgusting image. But sneeze being an intransitive verb doesn't normally enter into this construction. But we analogize. We go beyond the given to make new meaning. And I think that's a lot of what we do. I think using language, I think learning language, I think language change are all very creative processes. It's adaptive imitation. There is an imitative moment about it, but it's certainly not pure. So what about the social dimension? We're at a Nessa Wolfson Coloquium, after all. What's really important here, I think, is to see that there's a process of co-adaptation going on. So I don't just create sentences like Sally sneezed a napkin across the table, right? I interact with you, and through that interaction, the language resources we both use get altered. So I say this because often we've said, well, input is given by the native speaker to the non-native speaker, right? But it's not a one-way process, right? There's a co-adaptation. The language resources of both are changed, just as they are with a mother and a child or a caregiver and a child. Goldberg shows this using the data from the child's corpus, and here we are with constructions. I won't take you through all of this, but she looked at children's speech, mothers to the same children. She looked at 3 constructions, the intransitive one, the verb-object locative one, and the ditransitive is the third. And she found that that in the intransitive, the first one, 54% of the time the children used the verb go. So they went, right? Or we go. And indeed, not a majority, but a large percentage, 39% of the adults the mothers used go. In the subject-verb-object oblique, the verb most commonly used by both children and mothers was put. I put the books on the table. And in the ditransitive, the most common verb was give. Now, of course, there are other verbs being used. But the point is that we have these islands, we have these verbs around which we start to, and that are concrete, at which children start to learn these constructions and then build out from that. And you can see the co-adaptation. You can see that there's a preponderance of usage of just these single verbs with these constructions. I always have long quotes when it's my own words. I get very attached to them. Oh yeah, empirical support in the architecture of brain, because as you encounter a new instance of meaningful language, certain neural connections are strengthened, making a network of language-using patterns in memory. Remember, they self-organize. They're further transformed with further usage. And I think then complexity theory offers us a way to unite language, its use, its evolution, its development, its learning, and its teaching. Because real-time language processing, evolutionary change in language, and developmental change in learner language are all reflections of the same dynamic process of language usage, albeit at different time scales. They don't have to be different segments. They don't have to be different foci in our field. We can bring to bear a common dynamic perspective to our understanding. This dynamic process is responsible for the patterns and orderly arrangement both in the natural world and in the realms of mind, society, and culture. I love that. I love that this process applies beyond us humans to the natural world. I got tears in my eyes when I realized one day that a tree was like language, and that both are fractals, fractals being geometric patterns associated with complexity theory. Why not? Why shouldn't language be as natural as a tree, a natural system? But order is not sufficient. What's required is something much more complex. It's order entering upon novelty. This is what I mean about the creativity of the process. Because if you just had order, it would just be over and over again, iteration, repetition. But that's not what this is about. It's not about iteration only, or it's not about repetition. Novelty is always part of it. We do not communicate through reference to prior fixed abstract forms, but rather we create language as we go, both as individuals and as communities. I'm going to skip that because of time. Humans shape their own context. Experience shapes our neural networks. And this I said, I got a little grief for this, but I truly believe it. UG people talk about an end-state grammar, but you know what? There is no end, not to a dynamic system, and there's no state. And that's what I titled an article that I wrote in 2005, which, let's see, not everybody welcomed, let's put it that way, but I believe it's true. There's no end and there's no state. There's no target language because the target's always moving, right? Okay. So not so much stage-like progression as the waxing and waning of patterns. Some stable and adaptive and others fleeting. What findings? I've talked to you about the usage-based approach. I have usage-based theories of Michael Tomasello I didn't mention, but Adele Goldberg I did. I'm going to skip that. My own work showing the variability that comes about with learners in a form of a dynamical description, and then some of the work I did with Nick on corpus analysis and modeling. So just very quickly, I looked at in an article that was published in Applied Linguistics in 2006. I reported on this study. 5 Chinese learners, women coming to this country, accompanying their spouses who were graduate students. And they wanted an English class, and I was the director of the program at that time, and I said, sure, we'll give you an English class, but would you allow us to look at your, your acquisition of English? And they agreed, and that was the trade-off. And so we collected data over a 6-month period. We scored the data for those accuracy, fluency, vocabulary complexity, grammatical complexity, and we traced their development. I can't tell you too much more than that right now. I'd be happy to tell you more later if you're interested. So here are the 5 the learner data that's averaged. And we looked at accuracy, fluency, growth in vocabulary complexity and grammatical complexity. Again, I can tell you the measures we used later, but I just wanted you to see the picture. So if you were the teacher of this course and you had these 5 students as your students, how would you feel about their learning and your efforts? Would you be pleased? Yeah, you'd be very pleased because for the most part, with a few drops, for the most part, it's an ascending line. And in fact, in all cases, it's better at the end than it is at the beginning. Well, we'd like to think that. We'd like to think that's what happens with teaching and learning. Unfortunately, averages hide a lot, don't they? They hide a lot of the variability. So if you drop down to the next level and look at the individuals, this is what you get. Very different patterns, right? Some up, some even down, some regress, so to speak, by the end of the time compared to where they started out with. A very different picture at the individual level. A lot of individual variability, and even within each individual, up and down, up and down. Now, teachers know this. This isn't so surprising. But we often think of development as being unidirectional. That's not true. Development goes down, up, and all which ways. I'm going to skip that. Dynamic systems are characterized by persistent instability. Variability is viewed as a potential driving force. Variability, by the way, is not bad in complexity theory. What it's saying is we need to look at variability to try to understand it. It's often a harbinger, a precursor of development. I wanted to show you these from the same study because what's interesting to me here is that these are the 5 learners, that they are following, how should I say it? They've established their own priorities for learning, is the way I see it. That when we compare grammatical complexity with vocabulary complexity or grammatical complexity with fluency, for example, learner YYL, this purple line, can you see this? She seems to have decided that she wanted to work that we figure out the process and then we look at the individuals, because the two are married. You can't talk about one without the other. We have to instead, as Emma Yoshioda says, talk about the unique local particularities of the person as a self-reflected, embodied, intentional agent. Humans soft assemble their patterns, they adapt the patterns, at other times they innovate them. We create linguistic forms as we go. It's a creative process. The systems adapt to a changing context. Preferred patterns do become stabilized. It's not that we invent something every day that we're alive, right? They do become stabilized after a while, but they're always subject to change. The corpus study, very, very quickly, we looked at, this was Ellis and Fernandez that we report on in the Ellis and Larsen-Freeman 2009 paper, the European Science Foundation Corpora, looking at native speaker and non-native speaker interaction over time. 7 ESL learners, and we coded a lot, they coded a lot of data. They had a lot of verbs of these various constructions. I'm going to go fast forward here because I wanted you to see the pictures more than read the words. You'll see that when the intransitive construction was the target or what was counted, that the verb go was very, very frequent. The verb go is the most at the left on the horizontal axis. Come was second, etc. So you have this very steep, very frequently occurring exemplar for that. This is use. This isn't a teaching situation. This is an interaction with non-native speakers. This is native speaker language. You can see the same with the VOL. There's a 1 or 2 very frequently occurring verbs in these constructions that are used very often. Again, native speaker input. What happens, so one very frequent lead exemplar, what happens with the learners? Well, guess what? They mirror that, right? They mirror that. So they too show this preference in these data for one very frequent lead exemplar for these particular verb argument constructions. And it's called a Zipfian pattern, the idea that you have a few dominant, very, very frequently occurring patterns, and then it rapidly dies off. And the Zipfian pattern applies to a lot of things. For example, there are very few, very, very large earthquakes, fortunately, but there are very, very many, much less strong. We're very, very sensitive to frequency of occurrence. And I liked this line too. Language can thus be seen as a statistical ensemble of interacting elements, always changing. Learning then does not add knowledge to an unchanging system, it changes the system. It's not atomistic, it's not one by one. Learning changes the system. I also like this quote from Smith and Thalen. The idea, we don't have to separate the variability from the system to study the system. They're really one and at the same time. Variable single acts and the global structure that transcends individual acts are happening at the exact same time. We don't have to separate them out. So let's go back to those assumptions I said we were harboring, we were operating under, and look at what the assumptions might look like with regards to language development. If we take a complexity theory perspective, we'd say language is not fixed, but is rather a dynamic system. It evolves and changes in the dynamics of language use between and among individuals. You can say it's the degree to which the language learner's interlanguage aligns with the target language, but there'll never be total convergence. There are no discrete stages, although there are certain periods where certain forms are dominant. And we can't just focus on one subsystem. If we do, we get a spurious sense of the whole. It's both a cognitive and a social resource, a socio-cognitive one. Learners do not progress through stages of development in a consistent manner. There's a great deal of variability. clear instability. Individual development paths, then, each with all its variation, may be quite different one from another, even though in a grand sweep view, these developmental paths appear quite similar. I like this quote: knowing how to negotiate our way through a world that is not fixed and pre-given, but that is continually shaped by the types of actions in which we engage, is a challenge of being human. So we make our own way through the world. We make our own way through language development. It's not fixed. Oops, must be mine words because it's long. Embodied learners soft assemble in their language resources. As they do, their language resources change. Learning is not the taking in, remember, not the having of linguistic forms by learners, but the constant co-adaptation and enactment of language-using patterns in the service of meaning-making in response to the affordances that emerge in a dynamic communicative situation. Sorry for all the verbiage. But it's not the taking in, it's the enactment of this language resources. I think it's different. Maybe many of you have been thinking about this for a long time, but I haven't put words to these thoughts until very recently. Okay, I've been talking about mostly implicit SLA. As I say, Nessa Wolfson was a teacher, so we need to think about, well, what are the teaching implications? And I will just touch very, very lightly on these. There have to be some, though. And I think, first of all, this should not surprise you. Teaching does not involve the transmission of a closed system of knowledge. Of course, there are conventions of the code. I've tried to show that with some of the verb argument constructions. And they need to be learned for learners to make meaning, and those require both awareness and practice. Awareness often is called these days noticing, the form, meaning, and use construction. So how can I help my students to notice that certain verbs occupy a dominant or play a dominant role in a construction and then move from beyond that, for example? Practice is really important, but not the mindless practice of drills or pattern practice of any sides. That has to be what's called psychologically authentic practice. Otherwise, what you get is in the inert knowledge problem, where students learn to do what it is they're asked to do in class, but they can't use it in another class or outside the classroom. And so the practice has to be legitimately psychologically authentic. Notice I didn't say linguistically authentic. That's quite another matter. I said psychologically authentic. Learners need an opportunity to return to the same use of language over and over again. The same task repeated over and over again, because it's never the same task, right? The learners are at a different starting point. What's going on around them and in the world is different. How they approach the task will be different from how they approached it the first time, and yet they have to have that opportunity. I like the Aravat Nation study where they asked learners to tell a story to a partner for about 4 minutes. And then they switched to another partner and said, right, tell the same story in 3 minutes. Right, now tell the same story in 2 minutes. And what do you think happened? This was all during a single class. Did they get more fluent? They had to, right? They had to get more fluent because they were saying, at least their directions were to tell the same story in a shorter and shorter period of time. But they also got more accurate because, and you might not have expected that, but as they freed up their resources, right, as the story became more and more familiar, they were able to turn their attention to the form. And so the idea of being able to do the same thing over and over again, not necessarily in the same class, and you don't want to bore students, but we're so afraid of boring students that we don't necessarily give them an opportunity to iterate, to come back. It's not really repetition, it's iteration. If you think that this is all in my head, or all in the heads of North Americans, 2 recent books, the one on the left from Brazil, the one on the right published in English but with Italian authors. These ideas, give away my origin, these ideas are all over the world. Many centers for complex sciences, centers for complexity theory, centers for the study of complex dynamic systems are opening up or have been operating. By the way, that's just a smaller picture of the book cover here, and I wanted to show it to you because this is the famous Mandelbrot fractal, that double-winged figure which is associated with complexity theory. And then finally, or penultimately, if you want to see the birds, but finally, a mind that's stretched by a new idea, Oliver Wendell Holmes tells us, can never go back to its original dimensions. I don't know if I've stretched your minds today, but mine has been stretched. And because of that, I see the world quite differently today than I did even yesterday. Would you like to see the birds? Yes. It's just 2 minutes, and Dr. Hornberger particularly commented on this when she saw me talk about this. I find it very inspirational myself. So let's see if I can do this.
But the day is not quite finished yet. The Delta turns on an amazing natural display. Millions of European starlings gather in huge flocks, forming ever-changing patterns in the evening sky. The flock hangs in the air, then shifts and changes. For the birds, it's time to find a roosting site for the long, cold night. Starlings are masters of coordination in the air. No matter how many or how small the space between, the birds never collide. One minute they look like smoke, then without any effort they change into some pulsating superorganism seemingly from another world. In Tolkien's novel, The Lord of the Rings, Middle-earth is the land where the ultimate struggle between good and evil is fought, and the Balkans may still be coming to terms with its violent history. But despite its reputation, this is not Mordor, the land of doom and shadow. There is beautiful magic here. Somehow, the Balkans has managed to remain wild, unspoiled, a well-kept secret at the heart of a changing world.
That moves me every time I see it. I don't know if it did you, I get chills. That's from a show the British produce in Nature, and it's called The Wild Balkans. And I wanted to show it to you because of what I said before, that with bird flocks, as with language, as with human societies, I believe that a better way to think about it is not as a structure, is not as an organization, is not as a flow chart, but as a dynamic, emergent, constantly changing system. We self-organize, we come together, we create new meaning, new complexity through that process. That's stable sometimes, but never fixed. We live in a dynamic world, a world that we make by walking through it. Thank you very much. Thank you, you're very kind. I promised some time for Q&A. Is this a good time to do that?
I purposely came without my watch. I think we have some time.
According to mine, we have about 17 minutes.
Okay, so let's do a little bit.
It's hard to break the spell.
Yeah.
You want to break it for me? Go for it. Yes, thank you for remembering that. Right. Yeah, thank you. That's very kind. Thank you for your comment, Dr. Pica. So just for those of you who didn't hear it, Dr. Pica said that I was one of the first researchers to talk about the importance of frequency. And I did that in conjunction with my dissertation, blah, 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 years ago. And it's interesting. I've been interested in frequency for a long time because I think it's very important. Not just frequency of form, of course, right? But frequency nonetheless. And as I delved into it, I just said, I think we are exquisitely able to keep tallies as humans of the various experiences we have. And those frequencies mount up and they make a difference. That's what moves the system along. The time that I came up with frequency was, I can tell you, it was 1975. And the reason, and it was problematic for me at the time, because we were just coming out of being dominated by behaviorism, where frequency played a role, right? The more you encountered a particular stimulus, the more you developed a response, a conditioned response to that. And so it was a little bit with alarm that I came to the conclusion after doing my research that there was a link between frequency and language development. I kind of set that aside a little bit until it occurred to me that, well, frequency also is important in cognitivism. If you are a cognitivist, the more opportunities you encounter a particular structure, construction, whatever you want to call it, the more easily you'll learn the rule. So I thought, well, gee, frequency justifies cognitivist perspective, it justifies a behaviorist perspective. And then I realized that frequency was only a finding. It still needed a theory to interpret it. Just as I said before, you can look at the brain, and we do all these funny things with brains now. We do neuroimaging, not funny. We do these expensive procedures with brains. We look at neuroimaging and things. And we say, oh, look, the brain lights up there. Isn't that interesting? Well, it is, but it's only a finding, right? Then you have to interpret it. So I've held on to that frequency finding for a long time, not being happy with behaviorism, not being happy with cognitivism after a while. And now I'm happy because I have a theory, emergentism, that says frequency does play a big role. That language does that language is conventional as much as it is anything else. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think frequency, yeah, keep revisiting. Well, that is what we make the road by walking, right? We keep coming back to that same thing that attracted us in the first place. The questions I asked 40 years ago are still questions I'm asking today, because you always try to go at a deeper and deeper level. And you graduate students who are just starting out, I wish that for you. I wish you to find a question or two or three that you just get drawn to, if you don't already have one of those, that will nurture you throughout your professional lifespans, not to mention your own lives. Thank you. Did I intimidate everybody? Or did I confuse you all? Maybe I confused you all.
Yeah. Hi, thank you first. And I do have a question about your example with like intransitive and transitive verbs as a network. So if I'm correct in understanding that the verbs are like the nodes and the iterations are like the edges in the network, and the iterations are kind of what give the network its robustness.
Yes.
How different would the network look if we were looking at, say, a written text instead of spoken speech? Do you think that would change the robustness of what?
Well, it would certainly change the distribution of exemplars, wouldn't it? I think that's a good question. I don't have a very good answer other than to say, yeah, the modality, the other thing that occurs to me is, I'll tell on myself, is the difference between production and comprehension, because we have gotten into a way of thinking about comprehension as being really important in understanding the input. But they're clear that there are two systems at play here, right? Because what you understand isn't necessarily, I think, I'm not a believer in the non-interface, in the non-interface position. I think what you understand does not lead automatically to your being able to produce it. I believe the distribution of exemplars in oral language are going to be different than the distribution of exemplars in written language. But there's clearly going to be overlap of production and comprehension, and there's clearly going to be overlap of oral language and written language in comprising the network that you rightly characterize.
It may be the strongest network. There's the overlap.
I think that's where it is. I think that's where it lies. That's right. Yep. The reinforcing the strengths or the weights. Thank you. Well, I'm going to start asking you questions then, if you don't have. I mean, was this interesting to you? You seem to respond. Is it? Did I confuse you, or do you feel like you got sort of a? Is this? Here's another one for you. I think it's easy to say, well, everybody knows this. Everybody knows it's dynamic. Everybody knows language changes. Everybody knows this, don't they? And I've gotten that response too. But for me at least, this is a very different way of looking at language and language development, language use. And it's a more, and as I say, it's a more ecumenical one in the sense that it looks over time and it looks at different levels. It's a systems way of thinking. So is this something you all knew before you came? Yes, no? Yeah, that's part of it, isn't it?
Can I say, I know Kevin has your hand, but just one thing. When you got to your fourth, let's see, theoretical principles of the theory, and the fourth one was something along the lines of that systems adapt both through interaction with their environment and through internal reorganization and self-organization, which is a main principle. And in response to your question, what that immediately made me think about was the way we always have talked about language change, that there is both internal evolution and evolution that is through contact with other languages. So in some ways, my answer to your question is in some ways, yes, we already knew this, but in other ways, it puts it in a whole different, realm of theory that connects, as you say, transdisciplinarily, and it just kind of, I don't know, makes it much more exciting.
Right, I think so. I mean, it's intuitive. The reason I think it works for you, it did for me, is it's intuitively. It makes a lot of sense. And it's not like we didn't, but it names it a little differently. And, importantly, it allows us to connect the dots that we couldn't connect before. And to learn from one another. I mean, now we can look at the sciences, or we can look at different aspects of language development or language change, and we can see, it can illumine areas of our sort of special interests as well. And the birds, that's right, that's it, you've opened up a lot, but I often do get inspired by nature.
Kathy, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy.
That was great. Thank you very much. That was a very clear introduction to complexity theory and language. It's very interesting theories. I was wondering, you gave us, maybe I wasn't paying enough attention, but I feel like you gave us an example of how language use changes the system, but you also were asserting that language learning changes the system. And I'm not sure you gave a clear example of that. How does language learning change the system? Can you illustrate it?
Right, so thank you for your comment, first of all. So what I'm claiming is that in the use, the act of playing the game has a way of changing the rules, and that's going to be true of language change, but it's also going to be true of language learning. And, it relates a little bit. You want an example? Well, I mean, I think learners are creating the language all the time, and as they interact with other people, there's co-adaptation going on, and that language changes. If you stop and think, if you've taught language for a while, and I'm sure many of us have, you see, as a teacher, you start to change the way you speak to make allowances or to scaffold for your students the way they speak. And so there's that kind of change that goes on in the dynamics of teacher-learner interaction. But there's also the change that happens in the greater global arena. So, for example, this whole notion these days of who owns English, for example, as an international language, and who can change English. And we don't even, I mean, that's only an academic debate because it's happening all the time, right? With English as a lingua franca, for example, learners, users, see, I don't even want to separate learning and using anymore. I want one word for both, because we're changing English right now, you and I, right? In as I'm speaking, you're listening, and you're speaking, we're changing the system. So I think in a larger arena, non-native speakers of English are playing a major role in how the language changes, and perhaps accelerate the changes that are already underway. I don't know, am I answering your question? You still want an example?
So you don't want to really, you're not taking learning separately from use.
Right, right.
The way that learners use language.
That's right. So the normal way, right, thank you for the clarifying. The normal way is we think we're going to teach it, they're going to learn it or acquire it, and then they're going to use it, right? It's a very linear kind of relationship. No. It's in the use that learning happens. It's in the learning that use happens. They are one and the same time. That doesn't mean that we're all going to use it the same way, but it's not it's not preparing students for something. It's the something. It's real in that moment. Thanks. Yes. Oh, you go ahead. I'll make sure I get you. Go ahead.
Comment on the question also, thank you for very interesting talk and to respond to your question. I think it is very intuitive. What I appreciate was especially how you highlighted how this intuition you have about language really differs from the way you feel it in language in terms of teaching. And I was wondering if you could comment on the implications for language testing and assessment.
Yeah.
It seems like there's some real radical changes that have been made to apply these intuitions to what we did.
Yes, thank you for the comment and the question. I think language testing is a problem. I mean, it's a problem from my perspective, because what do we do in language tests? We usually get a snapshot, right? And we don't necessarily know what preceded it, what followed it, whether we get a different picture the next day. I mean, you're pointing to a major problem. I've also, just a little bit of an aside, but I'm going to use this as an opportunity, if I may. I've been intrigued by the call for greater accountability, and tests are often accompanying that, right? At the same time, I'm talking about the zeitgeist as being this fluid and dynamic and organic biological thing. We have this accountability and testing, and it's almost like you need a counterpoint to people are afraid. The thing is spinning out of control. English is changing, and look what's happening, and we have these immigrants, and blah, 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 right? And it's almost like you need a counterpoint to that. So testing has probably got a role. But how can you capture something that's so dynamic and ephemeral? I mean, there are people who are trying to answer that. There's something called dynamic testing, but it's based on a Vygotskian approach. People at Penn State talk about this. But it's not really the dynamic testing, I think. You can certainly increase the intervals at which you sample learner language, for example, maybe thereby getting a better picture. But boy, you saw my charts. You saw my graphs, I mean. You know, if you happen to get it in June, you got this picture. If you did it in October or November, you got what I'm saying, a very different picture. I need help in that area. I don't have an answer for that. I need language testing people to help me understand how they can come up with a valid, reliable, and equitable instrument that doesn't bias the portrait of a learner's competency, proficiency, ability, whatever you want to call it, because of its being captured just at one moment in time. I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a very important question to ask, because these days tests are very high stake too.
I also think I really enjoyed the birth that you feel that's all really nice. My question is about Creolicics. Creoles have a really big proponent.
Yes. Yes.
I'm wondering if when you mentioned that they reject the idea of there being language acquisition device, and how dynamic DST.
Yeah, or CT.
Dynamic systems theory addresses the fact that in different places with the same subject language contributes to a Creole spoken acquired very similarly.
Well, I don't believe that there's an innate language acquisition device. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that are innate in humans that allow them to be skillful language learners, users, developers of Creoles. I believe there are a lot of things. I was giving one example that we are exquisitely tuned to pay attention to frequency. That's one, right? We're very good at categorizing. That's another. We're very good at, there are a whole lot of theory of mind, of being able to take the other person's point of view. We have these cognitive abilities and predispositions that we bring to bear that I think do lend themselves to similar kinds of things in different places. But I don't think there's an innate language acquisition device. Okay, but there are cognitive abilities and there's social, certainly our need to interact with our fellow human beings. That alone, I think, is probably an innate predisposition that gave rise to language in the first place. It's the hominoid, trying to come together with others. And out of initially the vocabulary, I mean, it's not my theory, out of the initial use of lexicon and the syntax eventually emerged, gets grammaticized, and lo and behold, we have a language. So I think there are a lot of things that would contribute to similarity, but it doesn't have to be an innate language. Yes, I think it's an ideal theory to explain creolism. Yes. Yes, please. Maybe this will be the last one. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm not in charge. I'm always taking over.
Well, thank you for the discussion. You're giving a lot of thought, definitely. One point of testing, I was thinking about English language learners. How the test oftentimes places them in specific courses. Also, when I was a teacher, seeing students being contracted into specific courses over time. Looking at dynamic theory, do you think that sheltered instruction might impede that process?
Might what impede, you say?
Impede or kind of stagnate the process of students really aren't exposed to other types of language in different settings.
I hadn't thought about it. It's a good question. I mean,
I don't mean to be on the spot.
no. Do I look uncomfortable? I'm actually enjoying this. No, I'm thinking. I don't know if I know the answer to that. I mean, there's something to be said for being in a situation where you get to iterate. You get to have that same experience, over. But eventually, obviously, you're going to have to move on. Otherwise, what happens is the creative process takes over, and you have classroom dialects being created, which we know about, right? So we know from Francophone, from the French immersion studies in Canada, that there has to be an opportunity for an open system. There has to be an opportunity to go outside the classroom, so to speak. Otherwise, the system that self-organizes tends to be, this is, if you want, native-like target to be implemented. It tends to not be that way. I mean, the kids that are in the Francophone immersion programs, you might probably know, still have problems with adjective-noun agreement. Now, listen to me, problems. Now, this is a difficulty. I have problems myself with now the prescriptive, descriptive kind of thing. But anyway, why? Because they spent so much time with each other that that it's become a closed system. So yes, I think there's value to it, but it can't stay that way. Otherwise, the creation goes into aberration.
Well, again, thank you.
Thank you.
Wolfson.